This is New Patreon Series number 27 in the pre-Christian teachings of Jesus, of Yeshua. We're going to explore the genealogy and the family priesthood of Yeshua. This is not known or emphasized in the New Testament or the Gospels, but Yeshua was a priest. So was his brother. Now, Yeshua and his brother James the Just, Yaakov HaZadik, were Jewish priests. In this presentation, we're going to discuss why the Aaronic or Zadokite priesthood of Yeshua is unrecognized in the New Testament and why it is an important issue. For a good review of recent research about opposition to the temple priesthood establishment that Yeshua was a part of, see Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls by Craig Evans. You can take this link. I'm going to just read something from his conclusions because it's very important to understand that Yeshua's critique of Judean Pharisaism and of the temple priesthood was not a critique of Judaism, nor was it any kind of an anti-Semitic thing as it appears in the New Testament. Here's what Evans has to say. Although critical of the temple establishment, Jesus and the Essenes were committed to Israel and the nation's restoration. In no wise does Jesus' criticism lay a foundation for the condemnation of Judaism or the Jewish people. Jesus' criticisms were motivated by a deep desire for Israel's best, a hope that Israel would someday attain to its God-given destiny, and part of this hope was the anticipation of the day in the Olam Haba, in the Messianic age, when the Temple Mount would become a place of prayer for all the nations, all the Gentiles is the word. And that was part of the prophetic hope and part of the prophecies of Isaiah and others. Jesus feared that if the nation, that means Israel, did not significantly alter its policies, it would instead become a place of trampling under the feet of the Gentiles of the nations. His criticism of the temple establishment must be seen in this light. And by the way, the word you find as translated the nations is the word Gentiles. You find that in the New Testament. Now, Yeshua had a right to make his criticisms of the temple priesthood establishment because he was a priest. Now, the duties in pre-Mosaic Israel, in ancient Israel, or among ancient Hebrews, the duties of priesthood belonged to the firstborn son of each family, and later they were imputed to the descendants of Levi, the son of Jacob and Leah. Moses and his brother Aaron were from the tribe of Levi, and Yahweh chose Aaron and his posterity to serve as priests. So when Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Canaan, as we find in the book of Joshua, the sons of Levi were the only Israelite tribe that received cities but were not allowed to be landowners, quote, because the Lord, the God of Israel himself, is their inheritance. That's written in Deuteronomy 18:2. And David's high priest was Abiathar, but because of insurrection he was replaced by Solomon with Zadok as high priest, both from the tribe of Levi. So henceforth, high priests of the temple of Solomon in Jerusalem would be descendants of Zadok until it was destroyed in the 6th century BC and the Babylonian exile began. And when the temple was rebuilt by Ezra and the Davidic descendant Zerubbabel, who is actually the founder of the Jewish builders or masons, the building tradition, 70 years later, the Zadokite Joshua became the first high priest of the second temple. Now, the Zadokite high priesthood continued until the temple was defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes, who was known as Epimanes by his enemies, which meant madmen, and the Persian invasion that occurred at that time, that was finally repelled by the Maccabeans, or the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, we have to understand that the Zadokite priesthood probably was not historically active, nor was it the only form of priesthood until the time of the after the Babylonian exile, when the second temple was built. The people who wrote or who collected and put together and edited the Pentateuch, one source we call P, the priestly source, were the ones who advocated for the idea of a Zadokite priesthood as opposed to the other forms of priesthood that existed. And that's when that era really began. So the Hasmoneans replaced the descendants of Zadok as high priests, and that caused all kinds of problems and great controversy among Israelites. And this resulted in sectarian temple opposition from Zadokites and Essenes and the later John the Baptist and Yeshua. Now we're going to look at the biblical story of Jewish priesthood. This is not the historical story of Jewish priesthood. Among the most ancient of the Hebrews, as far as we can tell, it was the firstborn son of each family that performed priestly duties, and they were not necessarily all Yahwists. There were all kinds of priestly things that were done. But we're going to look at the biblical story of Jewish priesthood, which was constructed during the Babylonian exile by using several sources, one of which we call the priestly source, P, and other is the Elohistic source that refers to God as Elohim, and another is the Yahwist source that refers to God as Yahweh, etc. And these sources all differ as to who the proper priests are. One source, the priestly source, wants to make a particular branch of the Levites, of the tribe of Levi. They come from the son Kohath and eventually become the Zadokite priesthood, to be the only legitimate source of high priests in the Jewish temple, the second temple that's going to be rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah. But so we find them telling you stories like, well, God did this and said, you shall forever be my priests, and all this kind of stuff. And then we have another source that contradicts that entirely, an E source or a Y source, a J source, that says God made these other people priests. And you can Google this and look at all the contradictions there are about priesthood in the Pentateuch, in the writings of the Pentateuch. Just one paragraph to the next, God changes his mind and gives the priesthood to this group and that group and so on. Anyway, as we say, probably the oldest Hebrew priesthood was Levitical, and that was serving with the movable tabernacle before there was a Temple of Solomon, before the temple had been built, when they were still nomadic and they carried their tabernacle with them. And the Aaronic, or the sons of Aaron, Kohathite priesthood, that is coming through Levi, through Kohath, the Aaronic priesthood that originates in the house of Jacob, is fictionalized by the P source in the Babylonian exile to be the proper priesthood. And this is the basis for the understanding of priesthood in Yeshua's time. That priesthood came from the house of Levi, or the tribe of Levi. If you were a son of Levi and you were the firstborn, you were a priest. So there were three sons of Levi. Here is Levi. He is a descendant of Jacob, and he is one of his descendants is then Aaron, and that produces the Aaronic priesthood. Each of these sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, had specific duties within the movable tabernacle before there was a temple of Solomon. The Gershonite duties included moving the tabernacle, covers and curtains and screens, etc. You can see this written in green on top of this little chart. The Kohath group or section had the duties of moving the ark and the holy furniture with poles. They carried them on poles. And the Merarite duties, the third son of Levi, had the duty of moving the tabernacle poles and the boards and the sockets and the pillars and the bars individually by hand. So they each had very assigned duties according to the biblical report. Now, Aaron and Moses descend from Kohath. Here's Aaron and Moses, and Aaron and Moses are both said to be priests, and their descendants to be priests. And of course, there are contradictory stories about this, but here's where Aaron appears, and then the Aaronic priesthood is developed in the stories in the Old Testament. Now, there is another person I want to mention here because this becomes important when we're talking about Yeshua. The Abijah Levitical lineage that we find in the New Testament that goes to both Yeshua and John the Baptist. That's right here. Here's Abijah. He is part of a lineage of Abiathar that is said to be shared by both Jesus and John the Baptist, who is styled as his cousin in the Gospel of Luke. So there's an Abijah lineage to Hilkiah and Jeremiah that's attributed to Yeshua by Matthew's Gospel. Well, who was Hilkiah? Well, Hilkiah was the high priest coming through actually the lineage of Abiathar, even though the priestly source would want it to be the lineage of another line of succession through the Kohath priests and so on. And Hilkiah was the high priest during the time of the reforms of Josiah. And it was Hilkiah who supposedly discovered the book of Deuteronomy, another book supposedly written by Moses, even though it gives a nice long account of his death and his so on, and was probably, most scholars feel, written by Hilkiah as part of this reform, and became the book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomic source for these things that we found in the Babylonian exile. And Hilkiah is most likely, and most scholars feel, is probably the father of Jeremiah the prophet, whose writings are so important during the time of the Babylonian exile. So we're going to look at this Abijah lineage to Hilkiah and Jeremiah and to Yeshua and John the Baptist a little bit later. I'm just giving you a heads up on that now. Now, what happens? The Zadokite priesthood is established in the Second Temple by Ezra and Nehemiah, based on the writings and the proclivities of the priestly sources, who want to make only Zadokites eligible to be high priests in the temple and so on. And then there comes the time when Israel has to fight for its existence against the Persians. And at that time, the Maccabean family fights and leads guerrilla war against the Persian armies, and then the priesthood changes from a Zadokite priesthood to a priesthood under the Hasmonean dynasty of the Maccabeans. So there is a major change here. The Hasmonean priesthood usurps the Zadokite priesthood, and this causes tremendous division within Israeli priestly families. At this time, because of this usurpation of the Zadokite priesthood, which people felt was biblical and that's what was proper, probably resulted in the creation of a whole lot of separated communities and resistance communities based on the whole idea of priesthood and how priesthood was carried out and whether a lunar calendar would be used or a solar calendar and all this stuff. And in fact, the Zadokite high priesthood was moved to Egypt, to a Jewish enclave in Heliopolis, where it was maintained all the way down to the time of Yeshua. But the Zadokite priesthood did not exist in the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem in the way it had before, and it was disputed very much, and it became a tool of the Herodians, of the Roman masters of Judea after that time, and became a bone of big contention. So the Essenes and the Zadokites and many other sects opposed not only the Hasmonean high priesthood, but what was going on with it, and which was, it was becoming quite Hellenized. In fact, an awful lot of traditional Jewish worship and so on was being turned into things more similar to Greek and Roman temples. And so in the 2nd century before Yeshua, all this controversy erupted and these different sects formed, and a lot of people feel that this was the origin of the Essenes, and we know of another group, the Zadokites, who were the wanted to preserve the true Zadokite priesthood and so on. And they, especially the Essenes, developed their own lineage of teachers who were Kohanim, sons of Zadok, and they did not offer animal sacrifice. They offered bread and wine, because that was the only thing that could be legitimately done outside of the temple. You couldn't do animal sacrifice legitimately, as it was understood, outside the temple, so that in their private ceremonies they did offer a todah, which, as I've told you before, was the origin of the Christian Eucharist. And that todah was an offering of bread and wine, vegetarian. So, in Midrashic teaching of the period, the high priest of the Messianic age must be a Zadokite. In other words, he's a Levite. He's from the tribe of Levi. He's the Aaronic priesthood. And the high priest of the Messianic age, I told you about the two Messiahs, the priestly Messiah and the Davidic Messiah. The high priest must be a Zadokite. And in Midrash, the king Messiah of the Messianic age must not be a priest, but a son of David. In other words, a descendant from the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Levi. So with all this background, let's move ahead and take a look at what was going on with Yeshua. Now, there's much evidence that Yeshua and his brother James were born into a priestly family. They were not what the Gospels call Levites, although they were from the tribe of Levi, both Yeshua and his brother and his father. But they were what they call priests. The Gospels distinguish between priests and Levites, and I want to tell you what that distinction was. All priests were Levites. They were all descendants of the tribe of Levi, but most Levites were not priests. I'll try to clarify that. The Levites constituted at the time of Yeshua a lower class of priesthood. They also wore the same garb as the priests, which is a white linen robe, but they could work only as butchers and janitors. And if you want to learn more about it, here's a link. They had the right to serve as priests of the Second Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. That would be James and Yeshua had this right, not to be just Levites, but to serve as priests of the Second Temple, sacrificial priests in the Second Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Theoretically, one of them could also perform as a high priest. Now, a priest, or Kohen, the Arabic word is kahin, which means a diviner, as in the Urim and the Thummim, the priests who would do divination with some kind of instruments. We're not quite sure what they were. It's like today doing tarot cards or something like that. It also is an Arabic word meaning a standing one who stands before the altar. We're not quite sure of where the Hebrew word kohen really develops from, but a priest served on a schedule of rotation in the Temple of Solomon so that each one could fulfill his normal duties at home. So you were a priest, but you would live at home until your rotation came up. Then you would go to Jerusalem and work for a certain amount of time in the temple, doing sacrifices and other things. Now Yeshua wore the seamless white linen robe of a priest. For example, what we find in John 19:23 and so on. Yeshua's brother James served as an inner court priest. He served in the sanctuary, which confirms that they had a patrilineal from their father, Aaronic or Zadokite lineage in the family. Yeshua's younger brother James, or Jacob, or Jacob, prayed daily at the temple in Jerusalem, according to the Gospels. He performed the rites of Yom Kippur as a high priest in the Holy of Holies by demand of the people, because he was considered to be such a great saint, making the high priest appointed by the Herodians extremely jealous. And he was murdered at the orders of the jealous high priest Hanan ben Hanan, or Ananias, or Ananus, as he's called in the New Testament. So both Yeshua and James have lots of evidence pointing to their being from a priestly family, a Levitical family, not from the tribe of Judah, but from the tribe of Levi. Now James became the dynastic successor and the first bishop of Yeshua's disciples at Jerusalem after his death. We've talked about that on earlier presentations. Now we have to understand that Jewish priesthood was based on family patrilineal descent from Aaron. In other words, you had to be a member of the tribe of Judah. Scratch that, from the tribe of Levi, from whom Aaron came in order to be a priest. And that right of priesthood was transmitted through the father. It was patrilineal, not matrilineal. So under Jewish law, tribal affiliation was conferred through the birth father only, as we find written in the Old Testament, not the mother. So therefore, we would expect Yeshua's genealogy to show he was a son of Aaron, that is, to show he was from the tribe of Levi. But the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which were written about AD 85-95, several generations after the crucifixion of Yeshua, in a different language, in a different culture, who did not have a close relationship. In fact, were rather anti-Semitic at that point, because the early Gentile Christians were disassociating themselves with Judaism because of the Jewish revolt in AD 70. But the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written after that time, each would begin with a genealogy of Jesus, which is purposed and intended to show that he is of the house of David, because that's where the Messiah is supposed to come from. However, both create conflicting semi-fictional genealogies. I say semi-fictional because there may be some historical realities that are transmitted in those genealogies, but they are not true genealogies. They're semi-fictional genealogies to support the Paleo-Christian doctrine that Jesus was a descendant of David, and thus from the tribe of Judah. That's what the genealogies are created in order to show. And why was it done that way? Because that was the lineage through whom the Davidic Messiah was to be born. And as you have seen from previous presentations, Yeshua was an opponent of the idea of the Messiah being Davidic. So the idea was that the Messiah must be from David's tribe of Judah. And tribal and family affiliations of this type cannot be claimed by adoption, as people have tried to claim before Yeshua, although the theological virgin birthers try to show that James was adopted. Matthew says that Joseph's father was named Jacob, while Luke names him as Eli, Heli. And from then on back, the family trees are totally different between the one in Matthew and the one in Luke for 14 generations, and each genealogy is traced back to different sons of David. In other words, David had several sons, and Luke traces it back to one son, Matthew traces it back to another son. So we find two semi-fictional and contradictory family trees in the Gospels claiming Davidic lineage for Yeshua, for Jesus. There is a bogus claim by fundamentalist scholars or biblical literasts who want to show that Jesus is definitely from the house of David. So they claim that Luke's genealogy is for Mary, and Matthew's is for Joseph. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. Number one, Joseph is supposedly not the father of Jesus. God was the father of Jesus, according to these Gospels. He may have, and he adopted him, perhaps, according to these Gospels, but this cannot be transferred by adoption. And the second thing that's wrong with it is that the lineage has to be patrilineal, not matrilineal. So a lineage through marriage, through Mary, would mean nothing. It would not make him, Jesus, come from the house of David. So neither one of these genealogies really proves in any way that Jesus was part of the tribe of Judah. But that's what they try to do. So now let's compare the Matthean and the Lucan genealogies. Here's Matthew. He says, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, meaning from the tribe of David, from the tribe of Abraham, etc. He starts from the beginning and traces it that way. He says, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers in Judah, etc., etc., etc. So this is tracing it back to Jacob, because Jacob is the father of Judah, and the tribe of Judah, and so on, is supposed to be the tribe out of which the Messiah comes, and it goes through 14 generations and so on, to Jesse, the father of King David. Well, now, Luke's genealogy starts from the other end. In fact, you have to read it backwards, because at the very end you might see it said, this one that begins with Nathan, the son of David, the son of Jesse, etc., goes finally to Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. So in order to compare the two, we have to read backwards from God to Adam to Enos to Mahaliel to Enoch to Methuselah, blah, 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 all the way to Nathan, the son of David, as opposed to the other son of David that we're going to see in Matthew. In Matthew, Jesus is descended through Solomon. In Luke, Jesus descended through Nathan, David's other son, who was not a king. Now, as we go a little farther, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. So Dave, you might remember that David had an affair with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, and had Uriah killed, and all that sort of thing. So Solomon is a result of that union, and Solomon was the father of some people, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, etc. I put that in red because Abijah is going to be very important for us to look at. Now we get to the end, and after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and that's important. We're going to talk about that later. I put that in red. And finally it says, and Methan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Messiah. Now, in the Lucan form, we get from Zerubbabel, which we have from the Babylonian exile, but going backwards, we go to Mattatha, Menna, Eliakim, etc., blah, 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 and to Mattat, the son of Levi. So the son of Simeon, the son of Judah, etc., all the way back to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the son of Neri, the son of Melchi, etc. So now we have Zerubbabel as common in both these lineages. And then Luke says, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son of, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Eli, or Heli. So supposedly this lineage goes back from Zerubbabel to Heli to Joseph, and through, some people would say, Mary to Jesus, but of course it wouldn't matter because Jesus was not considered to be from the tribe of whatever the mother was, but from the father. So what we see, these things I put in red are important because they're things that may be somewhat historical. It seems that these two common features, not the father of Joseph, because it's a different father for Joseph for each one, and it's not any of the brothers or the sons of David, because they each trace it through different ones, but they both take it through Zerubbabel, and they take it through Abijah. And so we want to look at that because those things might be historical kernels of the true genealogy of Yeshua. The interesting thing being that that Abijah is from the tribe of Levi, not from the tribe of Judah. And one of the final things that we find Matthew says, he says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation, Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Of course, that's the way Matthew works. Matthew is very knowledgeable about Jewish things and the Septuagintal form, the Greek form of the Old Testament and Greek prophecy according to the Greek versions, etc. And he organizes things in highly organized ways that he tries to make parallel to apocalyptic ideas about how many generations between this and that and that and this, etc. So that's how Matthew's is organized. Now, however, it's clear that John the Baptist and the relatives of Mary carried an Aaronic or Zadokite priesthood. That's not in question, at least according to the Gospel of Luke, which transmits the legend that Mary's relative, Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, was from a priestly family. She was from the tribe of Levi. This is Mary's relative. Now, the legend tells that Yeshua and John the Baptist were cousins, that we have in Luke's Gospel, and they were born 6 months apart, and that John carried the Aaronic priesthood through his father Zacharias. Luke says, there was in the days of Herod the king of Judea a certain priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So his wife was also through the Aaronic or priesthood or Levitical priesthood, and he himself was through Abijah from the house of Levi. So he was a priest. Now, Zacharias was of the tribe of Levi and a descendant of Aaron through Abijah. And let's look at Abijah is sometimes called Abiyah or Abijah and Abiyam. Abijah means my father is Yahweh or is Yah. Abiyam means my fathers, or I was born of the sea, the ocean. We don't know, but that's the name that appears, and appears in a couple of forms in the Old Testament. Now, Abijah or Abiyam does not appear in the Lucan genealogy, but it does in the Matthean genealogy. According to Matthew, the Aaronic lineage of Yeshua's father Joseph, like Zacharias, was traced through, quote, the division of Abijah. Now, Abijah was the fourth king of the house of David and the second of the kingdom of Judah. He was the son of Rehoboam, the grandson of Solomon, and the great-grandson of David. So Abijah could be considered to be both Levitical and Davidic, and that's why he's permitted in the genealogies of Matthew. But in the genealogy of John the Baptist, he appears as Levitical, as someone of the house of Levi. Who was he? Well, he was a king, the second king of the kingdom of Judah, who defeated northern Israeli king who tried to attack him miraculously, according to the Old Testament. He defeated Jeroboam's armies, and by the command of Yahweh, he put 500,000 of them to death. Bang, bang, bang. And Abijah, allowed the high places, the sacred pillars, and even the male temple prostitutes, the Kadashim, to continue in the land, according to Kings 14. The high places were the places of the worship of the wife of Yahweh, the deity that was considered by many of the prophets to be a wrong form of Judaism, and the sacred pillars and so on. So he allowed the Asherah, or the goddess worship, to continue, and for that reason he would be evaluated by the judges of the old Israeli kings as a bad king. But he was not a bad king. He was sort of a semi-bad king. In fact, according to the biblical accounts, because he did good things by defeating Jeroboam's armies, etc., he was therefore considered to be among the sort of semi-saints of Yahweh. The Canaanite worship of Baal and Asherah, or Astarte, the wife of Yahweh, was part of the temple worship in Jerusalem all the way really until the reform of Hezekiah in the 8th century BC, and other traces of it were removed later in the forms of Josiah. So we know that ancient Hebrew religion was involved the worship of a feminine deity as well as the wife of Yahweh. And in Kabbalistic teachings at the time of Yeshua, the wife of Yahweh was called Matronit, and I've described that in earlier presentations about the feminine aspect of Godhead at the time of Yeshua. So if you want to take a look at King Hezekiah's reforms in the 8th century, I'm giving you a nice little link here. It's quite long, but it's an article that just was recently published in Biblical Archaeology magazine about a discovery that was made at a temple during the archaeologically that occurred during the time of King Hezekiah. What you're seeing over here in this picture is a latrine. It's a toilet, and it had never been used, but it was there, and it was put into one of the temples of northern Israel. It was conquered through the reforms of Hezekiah and so on. What was a toilet doing in the sanctuary? Well, if you read the Old Testament, you will find that it says the way you decommission a sanctuary, the way you desecrate it, is by putting a toilet in it. So here's a stone toilet that was put in there, but it was not a real toilet, but it was put in there for the purpose of desecrating that sanctuary during King Hezekiah's reforms in the 8th century BC. So only male descendants of Aaron could serve as priests, as we were told in Exodus. So we're talking about the father of John the Baptist, the priest Zechariah. So only male descendants could serve as priests, and so the wife of Zechariah, Elizabeth, was also a descendant of Aaron, so she too was of the tribe of Levi, but lineage for a son would be taken through the father Zacharias. So here's what Luke says. Once when he was serving as priest before God and his section was on duty, that would mean his rotation, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Now at the time of the incense offering, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside. Then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son." These were very, very old now, like Abraham and Sarah and so on. "Will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord." So here is Zacharias having an angelic annunciation, just as we're going to see a few paragraphs later for the mother of Jesus, Mary. So according to this legend, John the Baptist could have also served in the temple as an Aaronic or Zadokite priest. He could have even been a high priest. So recognizing these things, we're going to look at the fact that John the Baptist being a priest and Yeshua's being a priest, and the legend of Yeshua's baptism in the Jordan River, and find some interesting things there. First, we should say the legend in Luke about the annunciation of Gabriel to Zacharias, and that is thought to be the angel Gabriel, is not historical. It was undoubtedly constructed to parallel the appearance and annunciation of Gabriel to Mary that immediately follows in the gospel, also, which is not historical. The only historical information we have about John the Baptist, indicates that he was a famous baptizing prophet who preached an eschatological message of judgment against the temple establishment. And that would be the priesthood that was controlling the temple. Now, scholars have noted similarities between the message of John and the apocalyptic teachings of Qumran, the Essenes. Some have speculated that John was a renegade Essene or had connections to another separated community. The Jewish anti-temple sects were baptizing sects. They performed mikvahs, and they wore white robes. There were many different ones, and they had split off, and many of them have created desert communities to get out of Jerusalem, and as a prophetic denunciation of the Jerusalem priesthood, the temple priesthood that had degraded, they felt, under the Hasmonean abandonment of the Zadokite priesthood, and that were using a different form of calendar, no longer the lunar calendar, but the solar calendar of the Romans, and all kinds of things like this. And these the anti-temple baptizing sects that were opposed to the Hasmonean priesthood, and later to the priesthood that supposedly Aaronic or has a bastardized form of Sadducean priesthood that was now in the control of the Roman occupiers. They formed into separated communities after the Maccabean revolt, such as the aristocratic Zadokites, who were wealthy and created their own community, and maybe the origin of the Sadducees, possibly of the Essenes, but they were not brothers with the Sadducees of Yeshua's time. They were critics of them. There were also groups called the Banaim, the Hypsisterians, the Hemerobaptists, the Therapeutai, and the Magaria. Now, the Magaria are especially interesting, that existed at the time of Yeshua and John the Baptist. The name Magaria is Arabic, meaning men or people of the caves, and it refers to their practice of keeping their books and sacred writings in caves in the surrounding hills of Palestine. In other words, same place, same cave, same group of geological places where the Qumran, or Dead Sea Scrolls, were discovered, and where possibly the Christian communities that emigrated from Jerusalem just before the siege began also may have put their documents and so on. Now, doctrinal differences with the rest of the Jewish community for the Magira were based around the Magaria's transcendental view that God is too sublime to mingle with matter, and they were very Gnostical. They rejected the idea that the world was directly created by God, but rather held that an intermediary power, an angel of some sort, was responsible for that act and now represents God in the created world. And you can see that a precursor to certain Gnostic ideas, Valentinian ideas, the ideas of Marcion. But you also can see it in the concepts that were transmitted by the Mandeans, who considered John the Baptist to be the Messiah. So these, I've said before that the teachings of John the Baptist were much more sublime than simply being a we be all doomed type of a doomsday prophet. And so there was a lot that went along with that as well, and around the teachings of John. So I'm pointing this out that we don't know exactly where these relationships all existed and to whom or what John was beholden or had been influenced by in his ministry. But we do know that he was much more complex than the simple foil presented in the New Testament to be a precursor to Jesus Christ. Now, as I've said in an earlier presentation, John was considered to be a Messiah by the Mandeans, whose Gnostical teachings have much closer relationship to the Magaria than any other Jewish sect. So Yeshua was baptized personally by John. And Yeshua's personal hands-on baptism by John may have been a Magariite or Essene form of prophetic or messianic initiation or ordination or coronation, to be followed by fasting and teshuvah in the wilderness, drawing near to God in the wilderness. Because John undoubtedly did not personally baptize all the people. He had his disciples, and they all came into the Jordan River, and they were baptized by his disciples, and he preached. But we are told this, that as Yeshua's teachings in Halakha were far more evolved beyond the eschatological apocalypticism of John the Baptist and the Essenes, the other baptizing sects. But as I've said, it's likely that mass baptism was done by John's disciples, not by John personally, as we are told of Yeshua in the Gospel of John. It said Jesus did not baptize anyone personally, but his disciples did. And that was probably exactly the same modus operandi as John the Baptist, who would preach and teach and deliver his basar. His disciples would then oversee the baptism. But the story of the baptism of Yeshua is a personal baptism by John himself. So John's personal full immersion baptism of Yeshua may represent an Aaronic form of ordination associated with the Aaronic or Levitical priesthood. Leviticus 8:6, then Moses brought Aaron and his sons forward and washed them in the waters. He put the tunic on him, that meaning Aaron, and fashioned the sash around him and clothed him with a robe and put the ephod on him and so on. So this is very interesting what John the Baptist did. He personally did a full immersion baptism or cleansing or mikvah of Yeshua, and that is preserved in the legends. The early Christian gospel writers could not ignore John the Baptist, and the reason most scholars speculate is that Yeshua was for some time a student of John the Baptist, and he certainly did after John's death, and even before that he was going around doing the baptism of John and carrying it forward with his disciples. So the relationship is too strong to deny. John the Baptist was in his time considered to be the greatest of the prophets, and he was right there and representing the future of Israel and God's word to Israel, etc. And so he has to be in the gospel. The gospel writers have to subordinate him to Yeshua, and they do so by telling the story, but they cannot avoid telling the story that Yeshua was baptized by John. Well, what does that mean? And as I say, a hands-on full immersion baptism by John is not what John was doing to everybody else. Everybody else was doing mass washings or mikvahs under the direction of the disciples of John. And that's what Yeshua carried forward, according to the Gospel of John. Yeshua himself did not baptize, but his disciples did. So it's interesting that ablutions and mikvah, these kinds of sacred washings, were also part of all ancient Near Eastern coronation rituals, including those of Israel. And here's a reference you can give if you want to explore that further. So what was being passed on to Yeshua was very special. It was not just a baptism. It was more like an ordination or a coronation of some sort. We will never know exactly what it meant to John and what it meant to Yeshua. All we know is that immediately afterwards, Yeshua went out into the wilderness for a long period of time to fast and pray, that is, to carry on teshuvah, or so-called repentance, which actually means drawing near unto God. Now there's another thing we need to look at. What about Yeshua's seamless linen robe, which was known as a ketonet? In Yeshua's days, priests and Levites wore the seamless white, undyed linen robe known as the ketonet. And in earlier days, it was known as a talit or talis. It was mandated in the Torah only for sacramental purposes. Of course, today, observant Jews have a talis. A talis is a cloth that or a large covering that they put over their heads to do prayer, and they have the tzitzit, the tassels at the four corners. This is what the ketonet looked like. It was seamless. It was white. That meant it was not dyed. Made of the finest linens, and it was worn as the basic garment before other things were put on, as a white robe, you might say, by priests and Levites. In Exodus, we hear and we're told the story that he made the ketonet of finely woven linen for Aaron and his sons, the Aaronic priests of Israel. The ketonet was a long white robe about ankle length with long sleeves that came down to the wrists. It's very much like the Catholic alb. It did not resemble a modern Jewish prayer talit. According to the sages, without the proper ritual clothing, ritual and sacrifice would not be effective. It is the vestment that is holy, not the priest. And that was a very important commentary in Midrash at the time of Yeshua. The meaning of the ritual and sacramental clothing that you wore was what made this sacrifice or the ritual you did effective. It was not because you were a priest. It was because you were wearing the proper clothing of a priest. Now the Essenes and the Mandeans and the Therapeutae and other Jewish separated communities were said to have worn white robes to represent their Zadokite priesthood. Now we're told in John 19 that when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, and also his tunic. The Greek word is chiton for the Hebrew ketonet. So John is telling us that he was wearing a ketonet. And he also tells us, where Matthew tells us that the soldiers had thrown a scarlet robe over the ketonet, or a purple robe, as Mark says, with other garments over Yeshua's ketonet to mock him. Here are the Romans with their scarlet robe. Now his ketonet was seamless. It was woven in one piece from top to bottom, so they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This is what we hear in John 19. Now these were one-piece garments, these Levitical or priestly garments, the ketonet. And it appears they were made on a loom using a double weave, sometimes called a checker weave, so that there were no side seams and they were seamless. So this is what Yeshua is wearing. He's wearing a priestly robe. That's not to be confused with an outer garment, which is actually what was known as a robe. But that's a different thing. We'll talk about that later. But this is the basic garment that is underneath everything. And Mark 9:3 implies that Yeshua wore also a robe, which is called the simla, over his ketonet. During the so-called transfiguration, Mark says his robe, and that's the Greek hematia, the Aramaic simla, becomes shiny. Mark is always writes in the less educated what we call a historic present. In Koine Greek, if you read it, an awful lot of stuff that he was talking about that happened in the past, he talks about as though it's happening right now, like an excited child. And he comes in and he does that and he does that and so on. So this is what Mark says. His robe becomes shining, exceedingly white like snow, such as no launder on earth can whiten them. Now that's because his robe, the simla, was not the ketonet. The ketonet was the unbleached and the pure white linen. But the robe that he wore on top, which is like a coat or a robe, was not white. It was not unbleached. It was another color. I'm showing you an image of one artist's image of an ancient Hebrew outfit. He's got his underpants on, which also have tassels or tzitzit. And then here is the robe that goes over the top that is probably a precursor to what is the prayer chalice, the prayer talus of modern Jews, with the tzitzit, the tassels at the 4 corners, and the hole in the top to put over the head. Now, why did Yeshua wear a priestly ketonet beneath his outer cloak, or his simla? All Synoptic Gospels report that he wore a priestly ketonet with tzitzit, or fringes, hanging from the bottom, as required of observant Jews among the Pharisees and so on. In Yeshua's culture, specific vestments identified religious roles. Outer garments identified women as married or unmarried, men as rich or poor, priests, Levites, Sadducees, Pharisees, government officials, physicians, all had special things in their clothing that indicated their role. For example, prophets such as Elijah and even John the Baptist wore what was called the aderet, which was an outer cloak. In John's case, it was made of camel hair, but it was originally developed from and modeled after a Babylonian royal cloak, but simple without ornamentation. And that was just one kind of outer garment you can wear. Yeshua's wearing the simlock, but underneath it, he has the kenelet and the ketonet. And the ketonet has fringes. It has, especially at the four corners, probably, although it could have several. These are called tzitzit, or tassels, or fringes, and they were to be worn by priests on the four corners of their chief garment, with an interwoven blue thread. Apparently, Yeshua wore the priestly ketonet with tzitzit throughout his public ministry. Mark says, whenever he enters into villages, cities, or the country, they lay the sick in the marketplaces and beg him that might just touch the tzitzit of his garment, and as many as touched it are healed. This is what one modern artist's idea of the tzitzit would be, but the tzitzit are not a whole lot of little things hanging down like you would have on a modern Jewish tallis or prayer shawl. They were probably longer tzitzit on the four corners, as I've shown you before. Here's another place. Matthew says, many sick people begged him that they might only touch the tzitzit of his garment, and as many as touched it were completely healed. So he's not just wearing this on the night he's crucified. He's wearing it all the time. So why is he wearing a priestly ketonet beneath his outer cloak with tzitzit? Luke says, and behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the tzitzit of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch, and it's usually translated in English as the hem. The hem is simply a translation of the Greek word for the Hebrew word for tzitzit, the fringes. If I only touch the fringes of his garment, I will be made well. And she does, and she is. Now, clearly, Yeshua understood and framed his ministry as not only prophetic, but priestly, because he did his public work wearing a ketonet beneath his outer clothing that went down to his ankles, and had, or just above that, but went down much lower, and had at least at the four corners the tzitzit, or the tassels, the so-called fringes. Now I'm showing you up at the top. Here is an artist's rendition of Yeshua being touched by the woman with a discharge of blood, and she's touching the tzitzit. As you can see, it's a little string that hangs down. Now, like most early Christian art, which is 2nd, 3rd century, they don't use they don't know what a ketonet really looks like, so they have him in a Roman toga, but they have a tzitzit attached to the toga. So here is the person in the, this is one of the paintings we find in probably the Roman catacombs that depict this image. Now, some have suggested he wore the priestly ketonet only for his last mission to Jerusalem, to act as the priest for his atoning self-sacrifice on the cross, and I hope my previous presentation has disabused you of the idea that Yeshua had any idea of atonement or doing atonement and acting as a priest for his own sacrifice, because that's simply not historical. And so the idea that he wore his priestly ketonet only for his last mission, which he saw as priestly. No, he wore it all the time, as these quotes from Matthew, Luke, and Mark show you. He had a ketonet with the tzitzit, with the special markings of a priest. Now John 13:4 describes Yeshua removing his outer garments, which would be the simla. He might also have worn a turban, because that was very common to wear a turban over the head or some kind of a headgear, and his sandals, etc. He removed all this before washing the disciples' feet during the Last Supper. He probably did it barefoot, requiring removing his sandals as well, because for priests doing rituals, they had to do them barefoot. So when priests go into the temple, they don't go in with their sandals on. They take their sandals off, and then they do their priestly work barefoot. So he's portrayed as removing these outer garments and wearing only his priestly ketonet and replacing his girdle with a towel of a servant to wash feet. Now, what does this mean? Well, this probably symbolized for Yeshua, if this is historical, and I think it probably is, that he's doing a priestly act. What he is demonstrating to them is holy and priestly. He didn't do this to keep his outer garments clean, as some have suggested, but to emphasize the fact he took off his outer garments to wear only the ketonet, to emphasize the fact that even though he was a sage who was normally served by his students, he was performing the role of a servant to his disciples as an example of how they should selflessly serve each other, and by serving them clothed in his priestly garment, he indicated that humility and service were holy and sacred. That's the meaning of removing the outer garments. He wasn't doing them to keep them clean. So now we're going to talk about the priesthood that is ascribed to Yeshua in the New Testament and by the New Testament authors, and in Christianity and Christian Christology and Christian priesthood. It's not the priesthood of Aaron, and it's not the priesthood of Levi. It's not the priesthood of any of the Jewish priesthoods, even though he held those things. It's the priesthood of Melchizedek. Now, Melchi in Hebrew means king of, and Zedek means righteousness or justice. Although some scholars have thought that it might meant the king of Zedek, or the meaning a ruler of Zedek or a priest of Zedek, because Zedek was also possibly a name of an ancient Near Eastern deity. But in any case, it comes to mean and is taken to mean as the king of righteousness or the king of justice. Melchizedek was considered to be the eternal high priest of God Most High, El Elyon, in first century Jewish Midrash on Genesis 14:18, where he appears to Abraham. Before Abraham's name is Abraham, it's Abram, and gives him a sacrifice, a communion, a meal based on bread and wine. He appeared to Abram before God changed his name to Abraham and blessed him with a sacrament of bread and wine. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, Shalom, Salem peace, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of El Elyon. And that's what we're told in the description of Genesis. Now, king of Salem, there was actually a place known as Salem or Shalom that has been identified by scholars as a place that existed in those days. So he may have been the ruler of that town or that place that was established in pre-Mosaic Israel, what would become Israel. And he was a priest of El Elyon, God Most High, not the priest of Yahweh, not a priest of El Shaddai, God Almighty, God Most High. In other words, the God who lives at the top of the mountain, the God whose presence can be found up high at the top of the mountain. Now, Yeshua challenged the prevailing view that Messiah would be a son or descendant of David. We talked about that before. The Lord Yahweh said to my Lord, etc., in Psalm 110. And so Yeshua disputes that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. And that is carried forward in all three synoptic Gospels. But that same psalm, which was so significant to Yeshua, also tells Messiah, the Baranash, the following. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And that's where in the Psalms that occurs, the same psalm that says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit upon my right hand. And Yeshua points out that therefore Messiah could not be a descendant of David. And he says, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You, meaning the person he's talking to, the Lord of David, is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, who is that person according to Yeshua that David is calling his Lord? That's the Bar Enosh. That would be Yeshua's idea, not the Davidic Messiah, but the true Messiah, which is the Bar Enosh, the Son of Mankind Messiah. So the Son of Mankind Messiah is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So clearly Yeshua considered the Son of Mankind Messiah, the Bar Enosh, to be a priest of God in a divine and eternal order of priesthood, transcending the Aaronic or Zadokite priesthood, any kind of Levitical priesthood. It was a priesthood of all humanity and all the universe. Now the Paleo-Christians viewed Jesus as God's universal or Melchizedekian high priest, as the writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews argues. And I put a little picture up here. Here is the Jewish Aaronic high priest wearing his proper clothing, and underneath it is the ketonet, and then behind him are priests with red sashes, as was their clothing when they worked in the temple, and barefoot, and wearing turbans or some kind of headbands. And they're behind the high priest. They're walking along. But that's sort of what it would look like in Jewish temple circles at the Temple of Jerusalem when the high priest would appear. So the writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews argues that the true priesthood that Yeshua carries is the priesthood of Melchizedek. The new covenant in Christ, says the author of the book of Hebrews, is even more obvious when another priest, i.e. Jesus, arises resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest not through a legal requirement concerning physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life. For it is attested of him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And so the author of the book of Hebrews quotes also from Psalm 110, the same psalm that was so important to Yeshua. He argues that Jesus was both high priest, which is the term he uses constantly. If you just go to the book of Hebrews and search for high priest, you'll find all kinds of, just all throughout the place he's talking about it. He's both the high priest and the victim, the paschal lamb. That's what the argument of the book of Hebrews is. And that he offered himself as a sacrifice for sin. Now, he never uses the word atonement. He talks about it that Yeshua is offering himself in a priestly fashion as a sacrifice for sin. It's not the Day of Atonement. It's not Atonement Day. It's something entirely different. He makes it clear that Jesus is the Bar Enosh, who sits on the right hand of God. He says, here's an illustration of Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father. We have such a high priest who sat down on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens, and so on. So the idea of Bar Enosh, the Son of Mankind Messiah, that Yeshua preached, is tied up with the concept of the priesthood of Melchizedek. And Yeshua was probably Yeshua's concept, because that's what it says in the Psalms. And this epistle of the Hebrews, which is not written by Paul, but reflects the thinking that lays behind Paul's idea of Yeshua and his eternal existence, his eternal reality. This epistle to the Hebrews connects all these themes together. The theme of the Bar Enosh, the Son of Mankind Messiah, who's not from the Davidic lineage, but from a more eternal lineage of Melchizedek. And that's all connected together, and that becomes important then in Christianity. From then on, all the people ordained as priests or in apostolic succession are priests forever after the order of Melchizedek. And from the earliest times this was done. And in the Catholic Church today it's done, in the Episcopal Church, in the Anglican Church, in the Orthodox churches. You are ordained a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So let's look at a little bit at Yeshua's priestly ketonet and the Christian white robe theme. Runs through Christianity. Christian clergy wore the alb as a basic garment from the 2nd to 3rd century onward. And the alb is exactly the same style as what we call the ketonet. Now, speculation has been that the Christian alb vestment, which is a basic basal garment that is put on underneath all priestly clothes, originated as, well, one thing, some people say, a Roman servant garment. The word deacon means servant, and Roman servants were dressed in white robes. Or the Roman toga. Here we have Christian 2nd century catacomb art showing Christians all wearing white togas for an agape meal. And the white togas may have been based upon the idea of Yeshua's white robe. The Greek white robe of the philosophers, which is always used in all kinds of Hellenistic art and so on, we find it used in the Hellenistic synagogues, Jewish synagogues, in their mosaics, representing the prophets as all clothed in the Greek white robes, and priests and Jewish martyrs are all wearing these white robes. This is the white robe theme. The initiates of the mystery schools wore white robes. And the Christian book of Revelations is a story about the highest initiated Christian initiates in the heavens. It says each of them who are the martyrs in heaven, they're still alive and conscious. They haven't just decayed away. They're living after death. Each of them, of these martyrs, is given a white robe and told to rest in paradise. That means to be in anaposis, or in Shabbat, to rest a little while longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers, were killed, just as they had been killed. So this is the book of Revelations talking about martyrs. There are, I think the book of Revelations has some very early parts, but I think it was expanded quite a bit. This business of Christian martyrdom that is an important theme here and part of the Apocalypse of John is not something that develops until later, 2nd century. It's not such a major 1st century theme about the Christian martyrs. Yeshua does talk about the theme of the Jewish martyrs, but this is the Christian martyrs, and this is not really early 1st century because there wasn't a lot of martyrdom being done in the 1st century. So the extant fragments of the secret Gospel of Mark, which was probably written around AD 65, describe a white linen ketonet initiation into the mysteries of the Malkuth given by Yeshua. Yeshua talks about, or we find a lot of his authentic sayings about the so-called mysteries of the sovereignty, and it's translated as the mysteries of the kingdom. And we have extant fragments of the secret Gospel of Mark that describe a white linen ketonet initiation, or white-robed initiation into these mysteries given by Yeshua. After 6 days, Yeshua told him what to do. He had a preparation of 6 days. It was a week. And in the evening the youth comes to him wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. And thence arising, he returned to the other side of the Jordan. This is a separate event from the young man who came to Gethsemane to be initiated by Yeshua that we're told about in Mark. He says, and a certain young man followed with him, having a linen cloth cast about him over his naked body. And they laid hold on him, but he left the linen cloth and fled naked. So there was a young man who had come to the Garden of Gethsemane for Yeshua to initiate. And when the soldiers came, they tried to grab him, and he just slipped out of his ketanet and ran naked back home. Which, if this is historically true, would indicate that Yeshua was not expecting necessarily to be arrested in his garden. He thought he was in a sanctuary where he had some kind of protection. He didn't go up there to be a Christer. So Christian priestly vestments have several origins in Hellenistic mystery school vestments. You can look at the vestments worn by priests in the worship of Isis, the Isean temples that were contemporary, and many of the early Christian liturgies that were taken and were really taken over from and very parallel to the Isean liturgies, the morning prayers and the afternoon prayers and so on. But even though priestly vestments have origins in the Hellenistic mystery school vestments, and there's a lot more than that we could go into, but I won't talk about it now. But they may have also developed from special Jewish Christian use for the ketanet, or the white robe of Yeshua. So I just want to point out that this Christian white robe theme may very well be related to the priestly garb of Yeshua that he historically wore. So we have legends of the so-called robe of Jesus. Now, of course, we know that the robe was a simla. This was not the ketanet, but people didn't know that later than that. They just considered if Jesus wore it, it was a robe, and it was a white robe. And we have legends of the robe of Jesus. We have the relic of the holy tunic of Trier. And that's a photograph that was taken. I put up here on the right-hand side. People are coming to show reverence for this holy relic. According to legend, Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, who was a great collector of relics and went all around trying to collect things that she thought were authentically connected to Yeshua, like the true cross. I think she collected several hundred pounds of the true cross, and so on. According to legend, Helena, mother of Constantine the Great, discovered the seamless robe in the Holy Land in the year 327 or 328, along with several other relics, including the true cross, which she went searching for. Now, different versions of the story say she either bequeathed it or sent it to the city of Trier, where Constantine had lived for some years before becoming emperor. And that's how it ended up there. That's the legend. However, the actual history of the Trier robe is certain only from the 12th century onward, as in the case of most inauthentic relics of the medieval period. On May 1st, 1196, Archbishop Johannan I of Trier consecrated an altar in which the seamless robe was contained. Now, back in the medieval period, there were many, many hawkers and sellers of supposed relics of the apostles and of Jesus and so on. There are enough finger bones of Peter to probably reach all across the city of Santa Cruz. I don't know. But when people believed that they were authentic, they bought them, and then they put them in altars, or on places where they would build a church. They buried them underneath them, or in some kind of a casket or something. So these holy relics of the saints and of Jesus were used in this way. And in 1196, Archbishop Johann of Trier consecrated an altar in which the seamless robe was contained. We know that much historically. Now, we know that sections of taffeta and silk were added to the robe, and it was dipped in a rubber solution in the 19th century in an attempt to preserve it. That's probably why it looks so brown. The few remaining original sections are not suitable for carbon dating, so we can't really authenticate how old the robe was or what it was made of and so on, because it's been messed with so much. It's not possible to determine any exact historical path that the robe took to arrive there, and no scholars think it is authentic. There is no evidence of tzitzit, or tassels, ever having been sewn at the corners of the hem. It was not white linen, and it was not woven seamlessly. Here's what it looks like on the very edge. There's a bit of taffeta and silk that's been sewn over that, but there were no evidence of any tzitzit or anything like that. And it was not seamless. So I think it was originally an early medieval Christian alb that was discovered and purchased for the Trier altar, supposedly as an ancient relic of Jesus. But if you like inauthentic stuff, go to a streaming movie vendor on the internet and check out a movie called The Robe from 1953. Great movie. It has the distinction of being judged by internet reviewers to be one of the 10 most inauthentic Hollywood Jesus movies ever made. So get the popcorn and enjoy. It's got Richard Burton, Gene Simmons, Victor Mature. It's a great story. And of course the robe that they're talking about is not a ketanet. They're talking about what would have been a Roman version of the Jewish simlach, which is just a robe that is not at all historical. So for a patronage of $2 or more per each of these lectures and presentations, if you pledge that for me online, you'll receive PDF files of books featured in this series and passwords to Wisdom Seminars courses commensurate with your level of support, depending on how much you give. You can read about that online. So please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. And thank you.